There is an island off the northwestern edge of Europe that, for most of human history, nobody particularly cared about. It was cold, it was wet. The soil in many places was thin and unforgiving, and the weather arrived in moods that made long-range planning feel almost pointless. The Romans, when they finally got around to invading it, found the inhabitants painted in blue, living in roundhouses, and worshipping in groves of oak. They conquered it, more or less, and then spent the next 400 years wondering why they had bothered. For centuries after the Romans left, the island was a patchwork of small kingdoms that rose and fell and bled into each other, invaded by Saxons and then by Vikings, divided and reunited and divided again, conquered by a Norman duke who crossed the water in wooden ships and turned everything upside down. And then something shifted. Over the course of roughly 500 years, a blink by the standards of geological time, but an eternity by the standards of human ambition, this cold, damp, frequently invaded island became the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and a quarter of its population. The sun, it was said, never set on it, and that was not a boast. It was simply a geographical fact. How did this happen? That question is the whole of what follows. It is a question with no single answer. No one decisive battle, no one brilliant monarch, no one moment when the island looked up and decided to own the world. It is instead a story made of centuries, of decisions that were not, at the time, obviously historic, of accidents that turned out to be destiny, of ordinary men and women who went out into the world because they were curious or hungry or afraid, and who changed it in ways they never fully understood. This is that story. All of it, from the Romans to the Empire, from painted warriors in the fog to the navy that ruled every ocean. From a cold island nobody wanted to the nation that built them the modern world settle in. This one takes a while. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. This channel tells history the slow way. No rushing, no shouting, just the full story, told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. And if you're watching this in the dark, in bed, with sleep already pulling at the edges, that's exactly where this was meant to be heard. To understand how Britain became what it became, you have to start with the land itself. The island that would eventually be called Great Britain sits at the northwestern corner of the European continent, separated from France by a stretch of water called the English Channel, 21 miles across at its narrowest point. That gap sounds small. On a map, it is barely a whisper. But for most of human history, those 21 miles were enough to make Britain a world apart. The island is not large. It measures roughly 600 miles from north to south and about 300 miles across at its widest. Scotland occupies the rugged northern third, a landscape of mountains and lochs and weather that arrives sideways. Wales clings to the west, hilly and green and stubbornly itself. England takes the south and east, gentler land, better farmland, with rivers that run to the sea in useful directions and a coastline that is never more than 70 miles away from any inland point. This coastline matters more than almost anything else in this story. Britain is an island, and that simple fact shaped everything that followed. It meant that every invasion had to be planned and executed across water, which added cost and complexity that discouraged casual conquest. It meant that once the island was defended, it stayed defended. There were no land borders to patrol, no vulnerable plains where armies could simply march in. And it meant that the people who lived there, generation after generation, developed a relationship with the sea that was intimate and practical and eventually explosive. But before any of that, before the navy, before the empire, before anything that most people think of when they think of British history, there were other people living on this island, and they have largely been forgotten. The earliest inhabitants arrived perhaps 800,000 years ago, crossing from continental Europe on land bridges that have long since been swallowed by rising seas. They left stone tools and the occasional bone, but little else. The people we think of as ancient Britons, the ones with the chariots and the hill forts and the famous blue body paint, arrived in waves over many centuries, bringing with them the Iron Age culture we call Celtic. By the time Julius Caesar first landed on the southeastern coast in 55 BC, Britain was a complex society of dozens of tribes, each with its own territory, its own alliances, its own grudges. Caesar came, looked, and went back to Gaul. He had not come to stay. He came to see and to be seen, to demonstrate to the Senate in Rome that the edges of the world were not beyond his reach. His account of the expedition is one of the most famous pieces of military writing in history, and it tells you almost nothing about the people he found. They were fierce. They painted themselves. They fought from chariots, which Caesar found interesting because the chariot had long since gone out of fashion in the rest of the known world. And then he sailed back across the Channel, and Britain went back to being Britain for another 90 years. The serious invasion came in 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius. 4 legions, perhaps 40,000 men, crossed the Channel and drove north through the southeastern lowlands with the efficiency that Rome brought to everything. The tribes that had traded with Rome and adopted Roman goods offered limited resistance. The tribes that hadn't fought harder, Caractacus, king of the Catuvalauni, led resistance for years before being captured and sent to Rome in chains. He stood before the emperor and gave a speech so impressive that Claudius pardoned him. Over the following decades, Rome pushed its control across most of what is now England and Wales. It built roads, straight, precise, uncompromising, that connected military garrisons across the landscape. It built towns, London, Bath, York, Chester, Colchester. It introduced the concept of centralized administration, coinage, written record-keeping, heated floors, public baths, and wine. Much of this was gratefully received by those who could afford it. Some of it was resented deeply. The most famous act of resentment came from a queen named Boudicca, ruler of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia. When her husband died and Rome moved to annex his kingdom, humiliating his family, seizing their property, flogging Boudicca herself and assaulting her daughters, she gathered a coalition of tribes and led what became one of the most dramatic revolts in Roman history. Her forces destroyed Colchester, London, and St. Albans. They killed perhaps 80,000 people. Roman Britain, for a brief period, ceased to exist south of the Midlands, and then Rome recovered, as Rome always did. A governor named Paulinus regrouped his legions and met Boudicca's army in a battle somewhere in the Midlands, and the exact site has never been agreed upon, and destroyed it. Boudicca died, probably by her own hand. Her revolt left no permanent political change, only the smouldering ruins of 3 cities and a memory that has never quite left the British imagination. Rome pushed on. It tried twice to conquer Scotland, and twice found that Scotland was not worth the effort. The Emperor Hadrian resolved the problem by building a wall across the narrowest point of northern England. 83 miles from coast to coast, garrisoned by forts every mile, the most ambitious construction project in the history of the province. Hadrian's wall was not just a military barrier, it was a statement, this far and no further. Beyond it lay people who could not be civilized, or at least not cheaply enough to make it worthwhile. Roman Britain lasted nearly 400 years, 4 centuries of roads and towns and bureaucracy and trade and the quiet, persistent process of one culture absorbing another. By the end, many of the people living in Roman Britain were not Roman at all. They were local Britons who had adopted Roman names, Roman gods alongside their own, Roman architecture, Roman ways of organizing their lives. They spoke a Latin-influenced dialect. They worshipped at temples and attended public baths. They paid taxes in coin. And then slowly, it all came apart. In 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain that historians have argued about ever since. It told them, in essence, to look to their own defense. Rome was busy. The barbarian invasions of the continent had reached a crisis point. The legions were needed elsewhere. Britain was on its own. The legions left. The administrators left. The money stopped arriving. The roads were still there, and the towns and the walls. But the system that had maintained them was gone. Within a generation, the mosaic floors of Roman villas were being used as rubble. Within a century, Londinium, which had been a city of 30,000, was almost empty. What came after is not darkness exactly. The word is too dramatic, too absolute for what actually happened, which was slower and more complicated than any single word can capture. It was transformation. It was chaos becoming something new. It was the island left to itself again, beginning the long process of deciding what it would become. The people who came next have given their name to the country itself. Angles and Saxons, Germanic peoples from what is now northwestern Germany and Denmark, had been raiding the eastern coast of Britain since the late Roman period. The Romans had even built a series of forts along the coast, specifically to defend against them, called the Saxon Shore. But after the legions left, the raiding became settling. The settling became conquest. The conquest became home. The process was neither clean nor quick. It took the better part of 2 centuries, and historians still argue about how violent it was. Whether the existing British population was killed or displaced, or simply absorbed into the new culture. The genetic evidence suggests a complex mixture. The Anglo-Saxon immigrants did not replace the existing population wholesale, but their culture, their language, and their political structures came to dominate. The Brittonic Celtic languages that had coexisted with Latin were pushed westward into Wales and Cornwall and the far north. The language that replaced them was Old English, the direct ancestor of the language you are reading now. By roughly 600 AD, what would become England was divided among a series of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex and Sussex, and Kent in the south. Each had its own king, its own nobility, its own local customs. They were at war with each other, on and off, almost continuously. The kind of low-intensity aristocratic conflict that defined early medieval Europe, fought not for survival, but for cattle and land and honor and the complex calculations of dynastic ambition. Into this world came Christianity. The story of how England became Christian is, like everything in this period, more complicated than the headline suggests. Some Britons had been Christian since the Roman period. There was a church in Wales and a remarkable monastic tradition in Ireland and Scotland that had been developing independently of Rome for over a century. But the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, when they arrived, brought their old Germanic gods with them: Woden, Thunor, Tiw, Frigg. The names survive in the English days of the week: Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday. The shift came in 597 AD, when Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk named Augustine to the court of Ethelbert, King of Kent. Ethelbert had a Frankish Christian wife and was already favourably disposed toward the new religion. He converted, his kingdom converted. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and the mission spread north. It did not spread without conflict. Different kingdoms converted at different times, and the Christianity that arrived from Rome competed, sometimes sharply, with the Celtic Christian tradition that had been developing in the north and west for generations. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD resolved the most pressing practical disagreements, including the date of Easter, which sounds trivial but was a matter of profound theological importance in favor of Rome. Gradually, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms came under a common Christian framework, with Canterbury as their spiritual centre. This matters for reasons that go beyond religion. The church was, in early medieval Britain, the primary vehicle for literacy, for record-keeping, for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Monasteries were scriptoria, libraries, schools, hospitals, and centres of artistic production all at once. The great monasteries of Northumbria, Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Whitby, produced some of the most extraordinary manuscript illumination in the history of the world. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715 AD by a monk named Edfrith, is a work of such breathtaking technical precision and artistic ambition that scholars still argue about whether a single human being could really have made it. It was at Jarrow that a monk named Bede, known to history as the Venerable Bede, wrote the work that gives us most of what we know about this period. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731 AD, is the first serious attempt to write the history of Britain as a coherent narrative. He invented, for practical purposes, the dating system we still use, counting years from the birth of Christ, which he abbreviated as AD Anno Domini. He organized the chaotic events of the previous centuries into a story with shape and meaning. He gave the inhabitants of this island, for the first time, something that functioned as a shared identity. He called them the English. The idea of England as a single thing, a single people, a single nation, was, in 731 AD, still an idea rather than a reality. The kingdoms were still there, still competing, still absorbing and expelling each other's territory. The most powerful kingdom of the 7th century, Northumbria, was supplanted by Mercia in the 8th century, under a king named Offa, who was so dominant that his contemporaries, including Charlemagne himself, the most powerful ruler in Europe, treated him as a near equal. Offa built a dike along the Welsh border, an earthwork 177 miles long that still bears his name. He struck silver pennies with his face on them, creating what was effectively the first English currency. He corresponded with the Pope. He seems to have understood himself as something approaching a king of all England, though the South and North would have disagreed. He died in 796 AD without a capable successor, and Mercia faded. Wessex rose. And then, from the east and north and west, the Northmen came. The Vikings arrived, and England has never quite recovered from the shock of it. The first recorded raid came in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne, that same holy island off the Northumbrian coast where the most beautiful books in Britain had been made, where the faith of the English people had been nurtured for a century. The attackers came from the sea without warning, killed the monks, looted the monastery, burned what they could not carry, and left. It was not the first raid. There had been earlier incidents on the western coasts, but it was the most dramatic, the most symbolic, and the one that entered the historical memory as the moment everything changed. The shock was partly about violence. Medieval people were not naive about violence, and war was a constant background radiation of their lives. The shock was partly about the sacred, the idea that God would allow his servants to be slaughtered in his holiest places was genuinely disturbing to a society that organized its entire understanding of the world around divine providence. But the shock was also about something more practical. The raiders had come from the sea. The sea had always been, for the people of inland England, a border, the place where the world ended. It had not, before this, been the place from which enemies arrived. Over the following decades, the raids became more frequent and more ambitious. The Danes, for most of the raiders, came from Denmark, though the Norse word for all of them was Viking, learned the geography of the island's rivers, which were deep and navigable far inland, and began rowing up them to strike at targets far from the coast. York fell in 806 AD. East Anglia fell, Northumbria fell. The great monasteries were stripped bare. The learning and art that had accumulated over 2 centuries was dispersed or destroyed. By the 870s, the Vikings controlled most of northern and eastern England, in a territory that later historians would call the Danelaw. The remaining English kingdoms were Wessex in the south and a few client states around it. One by one, the kings of those kingdoms were killed or capitulated. By the winter of 878 AD, the Viking leader Guthrum had driven Alfred, king of Wessex, into the marshes of Somerset with a handful of followers, and it seemed to everyone watching that England as a political entity was about to cease to exist entirely. Alfred spent the winter in the marshes. The stories say he burned a peasant woman's cakes while distracted by his plans and was roundly scolded for it, a detail that historians consider probably invented, but which has endured for 1200 years because it captures something true about the period. The image of a king so far from his kingdom that he was sleeping in strangers' houses and forgetting to watch the bread. In the spring, he emerged from hiding, called his levies together, and met Guthrum's army at a place called Eddington. He won. Decisively enough that Guthrum agreed, not just to peace, but to baptism. Alfred stood as his godfather, giving him a Christian name and making him, symbolically at least, a subject of the same God. The treaty that followed divided England along a diagonal line running roughly from London to Chester. North and east of the line was the Danelaw. South and west was English, was Alfred's. What Alfred did with the decades that followed is why history calls him, alone among all English monarchs, the Great. He did not simply consolidate his military position, though he did that too, building a network of fortified towns called burhs across Wessex that gave his people defensible refuge and created the infrastructure for trade. He created a navy, the first deliberate English naval policy, with ships built specifically to counter Viking longboats. He reorganized the military obligation of his subjects so that defense could be maintained without requiring every fighting man to be absent from his farm at the same time. But what separated Alfred from every previous English king was what he understood about the nature of his kingdom's crisis. The Vikings had not just taken land and burned monasteries. They had destroyed the conditions that made learning possible. The monasteries where books were made and copied and taught, the schools attached to cathedrals, the network of literate clergy that held society together. Alfred understood that a kingdom without literate administrators was a kingdom that could not function, could not last, could not remember itself. So he built schools. He invited scholars from across Europe, from Wales, from the Frankish kingdom, from Rome, to his court at Winchester. He had key texts translated from Latin into Old English, so that his own people could read them. Most remarkably, he translated several of them himself, writing prefaces that are among the most personal and thoughtful documents to survive from the entire early medieval period. He wanted, he wrote, enough learning in England that every freeborn youth who had the means to be educated should be educated. This was, in the 9th century, an extraordinary ambition. Alfred died in 899 AD and was succeeded by his son Edward, then his grandson Ethelstan, who became, in 927 AD, the first king to rule all of England. Northumbria had been reclaimed, the Danelaw subdued, the Welsh kings acknowledged him as overlord. Ethelstan called himself Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain. It was not quite true, but it was closer to the truth than anything anyone had managed before. The unified kingdom wobbled and recovered, was nearly destroyed by a second wave of Danish invasion under Sweyn Forkbeard, and then his son, Cnut, who actually became King of England and ruled it well for nearly 20 years, integrating the Danish and English aristocracies into something remarkably functional, before the pendulum swung back again with the restoration of the English royal line under Edward the Confessor. By 1066, England was once again a single kingdom, one of the wealthiest and best administered in Europe, with a sophisticated legal system, a national coinage, and something that functioned as a parliament in embryo, the Witan, the Council of Wise Men, whose consent the king was expected to seek on major decisions. And then, in October of 1066, everything changed again. The Battle of Hastings is one of the hinge points of world history, a moment when a different outcome would have produced a different world. William, Duke of Normandy, had a claim to the English throne that was tenuous enough to make a lawyer wince. Edward the Confessor, who died childless in January 1066, had promised the throne, according to William, his distant cousin, sometime in the past. What was not in dispute was that the English Witan, on the day Edward died, chose Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, as king instead. Harold was English. Harold was present. Harold was by any measure the obvious choice. William invaded anyway. He assembled a fleet of roughly 700 ships and an army of perhaps 8,000 men, Normans, Bretons, Flemish mercenaries, and crossed the Channel in September. Harold, who had just marched his army north to deal with a separate Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge, marched them back south again at extraordinary speed. On October 14th, the two armies met on a hill outside Hastings. The battle lasted all day. Harold's army fought from the top of the hill in the traditional English style, a dense formation of infantry, shields locked together, waiting for the enemy to come to them. William's army attacked repeatedly and was thrown back repeatedly. The Norman cavalry, which should have been the decisive arm, could not break the English shield wall. For most of the day, it looked like Harold might hold, and then Harold was killed. The exact circumstances are disputed. The famous image of an arrow through the eye is based on a reading of the Bayeux tapestry that is itself contested, but the fact of his death is not. When the king fell, the English formation collapsed. William's cavalry pursued the fleeing English and cut them down. By nightfall, the kingdom had changed hands. The consequences of the Norman conquest are almost impossible to overstate. They reshaped the English language, the English legal system, the English aristocracy, English architecture, English church practice, English foreign policy. Essentially, every dimension of English life was touched, to some degree, by what happened on that hill in October 1066. Most immediately, it created a new ruling class. William gave the lands of the defeated English thanes to his Norman followers, creating an aristocracy that spoke French, thought in French categories, and maintained connections to the continent that English kings had not had before. The effect on the language was profound. English and French coexisted for 2 centuries, and the resulting hybrid, Middle English, was richer and stranger than either of its parents. The word for the living animal was English: cow, pig, sheep. The word for the meat on the table was French: beef, pork, mutton. This distinction preserves in language the social hierarchy of medieval England. English peasants raised the animals, French nobles ate them. More consequentially for the future, the Normans brought with them a conception of kingship and of royal administration that was far more systematic than anything the Anglo-Saxons had developed. William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, a survey of virtually every piece of property in England, every landowner, every tenant, every ox and pig and mill, recorded in meticulous Latin. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the world. It was not just a survey. It was a demonstration of what the Norman state could do. It was a statement that the king knew everything, that nothing in his kingdom was beyond his sight or his reach. The Norman kings and their Angevin successors, the Plantagenets, who took the throne with Henry II in 1154, used this administrative capacity to build a state more sophisticated than any other in Northern Europe. Henry II reformed the legal system, extending the reach of royal courts and creating the common law that would eventually spread to every corner of the English-speaking world. He also quarrelled catastrophically with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in a dispute about the relative authority of church and king that ended with Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. An event so shocking that it made Henry the most notorious man in Christendom for years and gave England its most famous martyr. The Plantagenet kings were, on the whole, more comfortable in France than in England. Their empire, and it was an empire stretching from Scotland's border to the Pyrenees, was held together by dynastic marriage, military force, and the elaborate legal and administrative machinery they had inherited from the Normans and improved upon. England was important to them, but it was one piece of a larger picture. That larger picture would eventually create the conditions for one of the most consequential documents in the history of human freedom. The story of Magna Carta begins with a bad king. John, who became King of England in 1199 after the death of his brother Richard I, was not simply incompetent. He was energetically, creatively bad at kingship in ways that managed to antagonize almost every powerful group in his kingdom simultaneously. He taxed his barons heavily to fund wars that he then lost. He quarrelled with the Pope so severely that England was placed under an interdict for 6 years, meaning no church services, no marriages, no burials in consecrated ground, before he capitulated and handed his kingdom to Rome as a papal fief. He was widely suspected of murdering his nephew Arthur, who had a rival claim to the throne. He lost Normandy to the French king, Philip II, ending a century and a half of Plantagenet dominance on the continent. By 1215, his barons had had enough. They rebelled, took London, and forced John to the negotiating table. The document that resulted, Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was not, in its original form, a declaration of universal human rights. It was a feudal deal, a list of specific grievances and specific remedies, designed primarily to protect the interests of the nobility against royal overreach. Most of its clauses concerned obscure points of feudal law that no longer apply. But 2 clauses have echoed down the centuries. Clause 39 stated that no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor shall we go against him or send others in his place, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Clause 40 stated, to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. In their original context, these clauses were largely about protecting the nobility from arbitrary royal action, but they were written in language general enough to be expanded, and expanded they were over the following centuries, by lawyers and parliamentarians who read in Magna Carta the foundations of a constitution that did not yet exist. By the 17th century, the common lawyer, Edward Coke, was citing it as the basis for the rights of every subject of the English crown. By the 18th century, the American founders were reading it as the model for constitutional government. The Constitution of the United States, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the constitutions of dozens of countries, all of them descend, in part, from a document signed under duress by a bad king on a meadow beside the Thames in June of 1215. John died the following year, still fighting his barons. His son, Henry III, reissued Magna Carta multiple times, cementing its status as fundamental law. Parliaments grew from the same crisis. The word comes from the French parler, to speak, and it described initially a formal occasion for speaking, a meeting of the king with his great men to discuss matters of state. But under Henry III, and especially under the pressure of baronial rebellion, led by Simon de Montfort, these meetings began to evolve into something with more formal structure and more representative character. De Montfort's Parliament of 1265 included not just nobles and bishops, but also knights from the counties and burgesses from the towns. The commons, as they would come to be known. The idea that taxation required the consent of those being taxed, and that that consent had to be given in Parliament, became established over the following decades. By the early 14th century, Parliament met regularly, debated freely, and was understood as a necessary part of how England was governed. This mattered enormously for what came after. England was not a democracy. It was not a democracy for another 600 years, but it had, by the 14th century, a political culture that distributed power more widely than almost anywhere else in Europe. The habit of representative consultation, of seeking consent, of working through institutions rather than simply through royal command, was built into the structure of English governance in a way that would prove extraordinarily significant when, centuries later, England began to rule large parts of the world. The institutions it exported, parliamentary government, common law, the rule of law in the sense of Magna Carta, were not simply impositions. They were, however imperfectly and selectively applied, products of a genuine domestic tradition. The 14th century brought other things too, things that nobody in 1300 could have anticipated. In 1346, an English army met a French army at Crécy in northern France, and what happened there changed the way wars were fought for a generation. The English longbowmen, archers trained from childhood, drawing bows with a draw weight that permanently deformed the skeletons of men who used them, capable of loosing 12 arrows a minute with accuracy at 200 meters, slaughtered the French cavalry with a mechanical efficiency that medieval warfare had never seen. The flower of French chivalry charged again and again into a storm of arrows and died. The English lost a handful of men. The French lost thousands, including many of the most important nobles in the kingdom. It was the beginning of what historians call the 100 Years' War, though it lasted actually about 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, and was not a single continuous war, but a series of campaigns and truces and crises interrupted by plague, dynastic crisis, and the occasional diplomatic resolution that never quite held. England won the early battles, Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, Agincourt in 1415, where Henry V led an exhausted and outnumbered army to one of the most famous victories in English military history. Shakespeare made Agincourt immortal. The speech Henry gives his men before the battle, "The band of brothers, the few against the many." And while Shakespeare was writing 2 centuries after the fact and inventing most of the dialogue, he captured something real about what the battle meant to the English imagination. The idea that a small, determined island nation could defeat a much larger continental power through will and skill and righteous cause. But the war that began with English victories ended with English defeat. The decisive factor was a peasant girl from Lorraine named Jeanne d'Arc, who in 1429 arrived at the court of the uncrowned French Dauphin, claimed to have received visions from saints directing her to lead the French army, and proceeded to do exactly that with a tactical intelligence and inspirational force that confounded everyone who encountered her. She raised the siege of Orléans, secured the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, and transformed the political and psychological situation in France so completely that the tide of the war turned in a way it never turned back. Joan was captured by the Burgundians in 1430, sold to the English, tried for heresy in an ecclesiastical court that had already decided its verdict, and burned at the stake in Rouen in May 1431. She was 19 years old. 25 years after her death, Charles VII reopened her trial, had her verdict overturned, and declared her a martyr. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her. She remains one of the most extraordinary individuals produced by the medieval world. By 1453, England had lost virtually everything it had gained in France. Only Calais remained, and that not for long. The long dream of English dominion over France, a dream that had animated English foreign policy since the Norman conquest, was over. But before the Hundred Years' War ended, something arrived in England from the east that made every military campaign look trivial by comparison. The Black Death reached England in 1348. It had already killed perhaps a third of the population of the Middle East and continental Europe. In England, it killed roughly half the population in 18 months. In some communities, the death rate was higher. Entire villages were abandoned. The agricultural economy, which depended on large numbers of low-paid labourers working under the feudal system, collapsed. The churches were full of the dying and could not bury the dead fast enough. The psychological trauma, for a society that believed everything that happened was the will of God, there was no framework available for understanding the death of half the people you knew was total. The long-term consequences were paradoxical. In the short term, the deaths created chaos, disrupted harvests, disrupted trade, disrupted everything. In the longer term, the scarcity of labour created by the mass deaths gave surviving peasants leverage they had never had before. If a landlord demanded too much rent or too many days of unpaid labour, his tenants could now simply leave, because other landlords were desperate for workers. Wages rose. The feudal system, which depended on the immobility of labour, began to crack. The peasants' revolt of 1381 was one expression of the new mood. Led by Wat Tyler and inspired in part by the radical preacher John Ball, who asked the question that would echo through centuries of English radical politics. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The rebels marched on London, opened the prisons, and for a few extraordinary days controlled the capital. The young King Richard II met them, made promises he had no intention of keeping, and watched as Tyler was killed by the Mayor of London in circumstances that remain disputed. The revolt was suppressed. Its leaders were executed. But the world it had emerged from continued to change, slowly, irreversibly, in the direction the rebels had wanted. The 15th century opened onto a landscape that was exhausted, damaged, and ready for something new. What it got, instead of something new, was a dynastic civil war. The Wars of the Roses, the name was invented by Sir Walter Scott in 1829, but it has stuck, were a series of conflicts between two branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. They lasted, on and off, from 1455 to 1487, and they destroyed the medieval English aristocracy with a thoroughness that 4 centuries of foreign wars had never managed. The root cause was a weak king. Henry VI, who inherited the throne as an infant in 1422 and wore it his entire life with the grace of a man who would have preferred almost any other occupation, suffered periodic bouts of mental illness that left him catatonic for months at a time, during which the kingdom was effectively ungoverned. The accumulated frustrations of the 100 Years' War, the loss of France, the expense, the sense that the country was being badly led, crystallized around his incapacity. The Duke of York, who had a strong claim to the throne and a stronger personality, took matters into his own hands. What followed was 3 decades of shifting alliances, battles, betrayals, and executions that consumed most of the old nobility. The Yorks took the throne in 1461 under Edward IV. The Lancastrians rallied and briefly took it back in 1470. Edward recovered it in 1471 at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, where Henry II's son was killed and Henry himself died, shortly after, probably murdered, in the Tower of London. It looked, briefly, like the Yorkist line was secure. Then Edward IV died unexpectedly in 483, leaving his 12-year-old son as heir. His brother, Richard Duke of Gloucester, moved quickly, had his nephews declared illegitimate, placed them in the Tower of London, and declared himself King Richard III. The two boys, the princes in the tower, were never seen in public again. What happened to them remains one of the most debated historical mysteries in English history. Most historians believe they were murdered, almost certainly on Richard's orders. Whether this is true or not, the accusation was enough. In 1485, a Lancastrian claimant named Henry Tudor, who had been living in exile in Brittany since childhood, landed in Wales with a small army. He marched through Wales gathering support, crossed into England, and met Richard's army at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22nd. Richard was killed in the battle, the last English king to die in combat. Henry Tudor became Henry VII. The Tudor dynasty had begun. What Henry VII understood, with the cold intelligence of a man who had survived by his wits since childhood, was that the Wars of the Roses had given him an opportunity that no English king since the conquest had possessed. The old nobility that might have checked royal power had largely destroyed itself. The surviving great lords were weakened, indebted, and cautious. A new king, starting essentially from scratch, could build the royal administration on his own terms, fill it with men whose loyalty was to him personally, and accumulate the financial reserves that were the foundation of everything else. He spent his reign doing exactly that. He was not a romantic figure. His court was frugal, his manner calculating, his foreign policy designed primarily to avoid expensive wars. But he was extraordinarily effective. By the time he died in 1509, England was peaceful, solvent, and governed by a bureaucracy loyal to the crown. He had secured the Tudor succession through strategic marriages. His daughter Margaret married the King of Scotland, creating the dynastic link that would, a century later, unite the two crowns. His son Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. When Arthur died young, Henry arranged for his younger son to marry her instead. That younger son was 18 years old, athletic, intellectually gifted, passionately interested in theology and music and hunting, and convinced, with the absolute certainty of a young man who has never been told no, that he was destined for greatness. He had been educated as a future Archbishop of Canterbury, not a king, and he brought to the throne a mind formed by serious reading and serious faith. His name was Henry, and he was about to change everything. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 as the most glamorous prince in Europe. He was tall, over 6 feet, impressive in an age when most men stood several inches shorter, athletic, intellectually formidable, and possessed of a personal magnetism that contemporaries described in terms that bordered on the religious. The scholar Erasmus, who met him as a boy and corresponded with him as a king, thought he had the makings of a philosopher king. The Venetian ambassador described his appearance in terms that sound more like a description of a painting than a man. He could read and write in Latin, French, and English. He played several musical instruments. He jousted, hunted, played tennis, and showed a theological sophistication that would later serve him in ways none of his admirers anticipated. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon seemed, in the early years, a love match as well as a political alliance. She was intelligent, dignified, and deeply respected. Their first years together were happy by most accounts, but Catherine's pregnancies ended repeatedly in stillbirths and infant deaths. The one child who survived, a girl, Mary, was not what Henry needed. He needed a son. The question of the succession was not merely personal. A kingdom without a male heir in the 16th century was a kingdom heading for crisis, and the memory of the Wars of the Roses was still fresh. Henry had to have a son, and by the mid-1520s, he had become convinced that God was punishing him for having married his brother's wife, a union that the Church, he argued, should never have permitted. He asked the Pope to annul the marriage. The Pope refused. The reason for the refusal was not theological, but political. Catherine's nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, who effectively controlled Rome at the time of Henry's request. The Pope was not in a position to humiliate the most powerful man in Europe by declaring his aunt's marriage invalid. The resulting crisis produced one of the most consequential decisions in the history of Christianity. Henry, advised by a brilliant and ruthless minister named Thomas Cromwell, and emboldened by the new legal arguments being developed by the Protestant reformers on the continent, declared that the Pope had no jurisdiction in England. The English Church, he argued, was a separate institution, subject to the Crown rather than to Rome. Parliament passed a series of acts that abolished papal authority in England, made the king the supreme head of the Church of England, and systematically transferred the enormous wealth of the monasteries to the Crown. Nearly 900 monasteries and convents, accumulated over 5 centuries, were dissolved between 1536 and 1541. Their lands were sold or given to the nobility and gentry. Their inhabitants were pensioned off. Their treasuries were seized. The dissolution of the monasteries was the most dramatic redistribution of wealth in English history, and it had consequences that shaped English society for centuries. The new owners of former monastic land had a powerful personal interest in ensuring that the Reformation was not reversed, which meant that the Protestant settlement, however contested, was supported by the economic self-interest of virtually the entire English ruling class. Theologically, Henry's Reformation was cautious. He did not particularly like Lutheranism and rejected most of its doctrinal innovations. The Church of England under Henry remained largely Catholic in its theology and practice, differing from Rome primarily in the matter of papal authority and in the practical question of who controlled its enormous assets. Actual Protestant theology would arrive under his son Edward and be consolidated, after a terrifying reversal, under his daughter Mary, under his younger daughter Elizabeth. Henry's personal life, which is what most people know about him, was a consequence of his political situation more than a cause of it. He married 6 times in the course of 38 years. Catherine of Aragon, whose marriage was annulled; Anne Boleyn, who was executed; Jane Seymour, who died after childbirth; Anne of Cleves, whose marriage was annulled; Catherine Howard, who was executed; and Catherine Parr, who survived him. Of these, only Jane Seymour gave him the male heir he desperately wanted. Edward, born in 1537. He died in 1547, enormously fat. The physical collapse of his later years was probably caused by a jousting injury to his leg that never healed properly, leading to infections and the compensatory immobility that destroyed his health, and enormously powerful. The England he left behind was transformed from the one he had inherited. Protestant in its official religion, freed from Rome, enriched by monastic wealth, and governed by a royal administration that was more professional and more systematic than anything that had existed before him. His son, Edward VI, who took the throne at 9 years old, pushed the Reformation further and faster. The cautious Catholicism of Henry's church gave way to genuine Protestant theology. The Mass was abolished, altars were replaced by communion tables, the beautiful Latin liturgy was replaced by the first versions of the Book of Common Prayer. Edward died at 15, probably of tuberculosis, and was succeeded briefly by his Protestant cousin, Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, who was placed on the throne by Protestant nobles hoping to prevent the Catholic succession, and who was executed at 16 after Mary Tudor's forces swept her aside. Mary, Bloody Mary to her Protestant critics, though the nickname was invented by later propagandists, was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, deeply Catholic, deeply pious, and determined to restore England to Rome. She married Philip II of Spain, reunited England with the papacy, and burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in a religious persecution that, while considerably less severe than what was happening simultaneously on the continent, shocked the Protestant imagination and entered English memory as a symbol of Catholic tyranny. The Protestant martyrs' accounts, compiled by the minister John Fox in a best-selling book called Acts and Monuments, popularly known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, shaped English Protestant identity for generations. Mary died in 1558, childless, having lost Calais, the last English possession in France, to the French. She is reported to have said that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved on her heart. Her half-sister Elizabeth, 25 years old, red-haired, highly educated, and possessed of a political intelligence that her father would have recognized and admired, became Queen of England on November 17th, 1558. Elizabethan was the most extraordinary monarch England had ever produced, and possibly the most extraordinary it would ever produce. The assessment is not simply about intelligence, though she had that in abundance. She spoke 6 languages, was a serious classical scholar, and had received an education superior to most men of her era. It is about the combination of intelligence with something harder to name, a political instinct so acute that it bordered on the uncanny, an ability to read power and manage it and survive it that she had developed in the years of her father's reign and her siblings' reigns, during which the wrong word or the wrong friendship or the wrong religious affiliation could mean imprisonment and death. Elizabeth had been imprisoned in the Tower by her sister Mary, suspected of involvement in Protestant plots. She had survived that. She had survived everything. She came to the throne of a kingdom that was, by most objective measures, in very bad shape. The treasury was empty, depleted by wars and the extraordinary expense of the Marian persecution. The country was divided between Catholic and Protestant with an intensity that had, under Mary, produced political violence. The great European powers, France and Spain, both had interests that were hostile to English independence. And the question that everyone was asking, with varying degrees of urgency, was, who would Elizabeth marry? The question was not prurient. In the 16th century, an unmarried female monarch was, from a dynastic perspective, a catastrophe waiting to happen. Without an heir, the Protestant settlement was one assassination away from a Catholic succession. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry was immense, constant, and came from virtually everyone around her, her council, her parliament, her subjects, foreign powers who all had preferred candidates. She listened to all of them, led several suitors on for years, with what seemed like genuine encouragement, and never married anyone. Whether this was strategy, psychology, or both has been debated by historians for 4.5 centuries. What is clear is that the refusal to marry gave Elizabeth something valuable: control. An unmarried queen was, paradoxically, more powerful than a married one, because a married queen in the 16th century would have been expected to defer to her husband, and Elizabeth had absolutely no intention of deferring to anyone. Her authority was hers, and she was keeping it. The religious settlement she constructed in 1559 was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. The Church of England was Protestant in its theology, Calvinist in its leanings, but retained enough of the old Catholic forms. The vestments, the liturgy, the episcopal hierarchy, to give conservatives something to hold on to. It pleased nobody completely and alienated nobody entirely, which was, from a political standpoint, the optimal outcome. The settlement endured, with modifications, and the Church of England it created is still there. The great crisis of her reign was Spain. Philip II, who had been Mary's husband and England's king consort for 5 years, watched Elizabeth's Protestant England with increasing hostility. English privateers, pirates with royal approval, raided Spanish shipping in the Caribbean with cheerful impunity. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, becoming only the second person in history to do so. and returned with a cargo of Spanish silver plundered from Pacific shipping lanes. Elizabeth knighted him on the deck of his ship. Philip was apoplectic. The breaking point was Elizabeth's support for the Protestant rebels in the Spanish Netherlands and, more directly, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587. Mary, Elizabeth's Catholic cousin and the next in line to the English throne, had been in English captivity for 19 years, the object of repeated Catholic plots to place her on the English throne in Elizabeth's place. When evidence of a specific conspiracy emerged, Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant. The execution of an anointed queen was an act that shocked Catholic Europe, and it resolved Philip's hesitation. The following year, he sent the Armada. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was the largest naval force ever assembled in northern European waters. 130 ships, carrying nearly 30,000 men, intended to escort a Spanish army from the Netherlands to the English coast and overthrow the heretic queen. It should, on paper, have worked. Spain was the greatest military power in the world. England's navy was smaller, its army was tiny, and its defences were largely untested. What defeated the Armada was not, primarily, English naval genius. It was weather. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham, with Drake as his vice-admiral, harried the Armada up the Channel with long-range gunnery that inflicted damage without decisive engagement. A famous night attack using fire ships disrupted the Armada's formation off Calais. And then the storms came. First-class North Atlantic gales that drove the Armada north around Scotland and west around Ireland, wrecking perhaps 60 ships on the coasts before the survivors straggled back to Spain. Perhaps 20,000 Spaniards died. Elizabeth addressed her troops at Tilbury before the battle was decided, in a speech that has lived in the English imagination ever since. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Whether she said exactly these words is impossible to verify. The earliest written version dates from over 30 years after the event, but they captured something true about how the English understood their queen and how she understood herself. The Armada's defeat did not end the war with Spain, which continued in various forms until 1604, but it changed the psychological weather. The Protestant island had survived the greatest Catholic power in the world. Providence, the in English Protestant mind concluded, was on their side. The conviction that England had a special destiny, that God had preserved it for some purpose, was not invented in 1588, but it was confirmed and intensified by it, and it would inform English behaviour for a very long time. Elizabeth died in 1603, childless as she had been born. She had ruled for 45 years and transformed a small, peripheral, debt-ridden kingdom into a confident, outward-looking state, with the beginnings of a maritime commercial empire and a cultural flowering, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, Donner, Drake, Raleigh, that has never been surpassed in the English language. She had no successor of her blood. The throne passed to her cousin's son, James II of Scotland, who became James I of England. For the first time, England and Scotland shared a monarch, James. I was not, by most accounts, a lovable man. He was learned, genuinely, impressively learned, one of the most intellectually sophisticated people ever to sit on the English throne. But he was also physically awkward, chronically anxious, and possessed of a conception of royal authority so absolute that it created trouble from the first moment of his reign. He believed in the divine right of kings with a theological intensity that his English subjects, shaped by a century of Magna Carta tradition and parliamentary practice, found difficult to share. He wrote a book about it. Several books, in fact. His subjects read them and grew concerned. The problems were not immediately catastrophic. The Hampton Court Conference of 1604, which James convened to discuss religious grievances, produced the King James Bible, which is perhaps the most beautiful book ever written in English and which shaped the prose style of the English-speaking world for 4 centuries. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament during the state opening, was discovered and foiled, and its failure reinforced the Protestant conviction that providential forces were protecting England. But the structural tension between royal prerogative and parliamentary privilege was always there, and it grew worse under James's son, Charles I, who came to the throne in 1625. Charles believed in royal authority even more fervently than his father, and was rather less adept at managing the political consequences of that belief. He dissolved Parliament 3 times in the first 4 years of his reign, when it refused to grant him the money he needed. He ruled without Parliament for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, funding his government through methods of dubious legality. He married a French Catholic princess, alarming Protestant England. He attempted to impose a new prayer book on Presbyterian Scotland, and Scotland rebelled. To suppress the Scottish rebellion, he needed an army. An army needed money. Money required parliamentary approval. Parliament, recalled in 1640 for the first time in 11 years, was not in a cooperative mood. The Long Parliament, so called because it sat, in various forms for 20 years, immediately went to work dismantling the mechanisms of royal prerogative. It abolished the courts Charles had used to rule without parliamentary oversight. It passed acts preventing Parliament from being dissolved without its own consent. It executed the King's chief minister, the Earl of Strafford, despite Charles's anguished attempts to save him. And it increasingly became the vehicle for a form of Protestantism, Puritanism that went far beyond the Elizabethan settlement and demanded a thorough, unapologetic reformation of English religion and English society. The English Civil War began in 1642, when Charles raised his standard at Nottingham. It was not a war between social classes in the modern sense. Both sides drew support from all levels of English society, but it was a war about something fundamental: the question of where ultimate authority lay in the English constitution. The king said it lay with the crown, Parliament said it lay with Parliament, and behind Parliament, increasingly, stood an army. Oliver Cromwell was the most unlikely revolutionary in English history. A Huntingdonshire gentleman of modest means, he had been unremarkable through his 40s, a member of Parliament who rarely spoke, known mainly for his intense Puritan piety. The war discovered in him a military genius of the first order. He created and trained the New Model Army, a professional fighting force organized on merit rather than social rank, officered by men chosen for ability rather than birth, paid regularly and governed by strict discipline. It was the most modern army in Europe, and it won. The First Civil War ended in 1646 with the king's defeat and capture. A second war, Charles had intrigued with the Scots to re-invade, ended in 1648, and then Parliament, purged of its moderate members by the army in what became known as Pride's Purge, tried the king for treason against his own people. Charles VIII was executed on January 30th, 1649, on a scaffold built outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, a building whose ceiling, painted by Rubens, celebrated the divine right of kings. He wore 2 shirts so that he would not shiver in the cold and be thought afraid. He gave a composed and dignified speech, forgave his enemies, and placed his head on the block. The executioner severed it with a single blow. The crowd, eyewitnesses reported, let out a groan unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound of collective horror at what had just happened or what England had just become. For the first time in the history of Western Europe, a reigning monarch had been tried by his subjects, convicted, and publicly executed. The implications took decades to fully work out. England without a king was called the Commonwealth, and it was an experiment that lasted 11 years and satisfied almost nobody. Oliver Cromwell proved as adept a ruler as he was a soldier, but his radicalism had limits. He suppressed the more extreme sectarians, the Levellers, who wanted genuine popular democracy, and the Fifth Monarchists, who wanted to prepare the world for the second coming of Christ. He conquered Ireland with a ferocity that left a wound still unhealed 3.5 centuries later. The sieges of Drogheda and Wexford, in which the entire garrisons were killed, were tactical decisions by Cromwell's military logic, but they became, in Irish memory, something else entirely. He conquered Scotland, incorporating it into a united Commonwealth with England for the first time. He ruled England as Lord Protector from 1653 until his death in 1658, wielding a power that was in practice indistinguishable from what he had fought the king to prevent. Parliament proved as unmanageable for him as it had been for Charles. He dissolved it multiple times. He governed through major generals, military administrators assigned to the regions, whose Puritan discipline, closing theatres, suppressing traditional festivals, imposing a moral austerity on public life, made him deeply unpopular. When he died, his son Richard succeeded him as protector. Richard lasted 9 months. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 was greeted with a relief that shaded into ecstasy. The diarist Samuel Pepys, watching the king ride through London surrounded by celebratory crowds, wrote that he was so transported by the joy he saw that he wept. The theatres opened, the Puritans retreated. The strict austerity of the interregnum gave way to a court culture that was, in deliberate and flamboyant contrast, the most sophisticated and sexually permissive in Europe. Charles II was intelligent, charming, witty, genuinely interested in science. He founded the Royal Society, which became the most important scientific institution in the country, and constitutionally incapable of telling the truth to anyone. He had spent his exile making promises to every European power that would listen, and he spent his reign managing the consequences of those promises while keeping the peace at home. He had 12 acknowledged illegitimate children by 7 mistresses, and no legitimate children at all, which meant the throne would pass to his Catholic brother James. The prospect of a Catholic king triggered a genuine constitutional crisis. An attempt to exclude James from the succession by Act of Parliament. The exclusion crisis of 1679–1681 failed when Charles outmaneuvered his opponents. The crisis produced 2 things of lasting consequence. The words Whig and Tory, which began as insults hurled across the parliamentary divide and became the names of the 2 great parties of English politics. And John Locke, who wrote his 2 treatises of government in response to the crisis and produced the most influential political philosophy in the history of liberalism. Government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. The people have the right to remove a government that fails in its duties. These ideas, formulated in England in the 1680s, would find their most dramatic expression in America a century later. James II became king in 1685 and proceeded to confirm every fear his opponents had harbored. He appointed Catholics to military and civil positions. He issued a declaration of indulgence, suspending the laws against Catholic and non-conformist worship. He prorogued Parliament. When his second wife gave birth to a son in 1688, providing a Catholic succession that now stretched into the indefinite future, 7 leading nobles wrote a letter to William of Orange, the Protestant husband of James's elder daughter Mary, inviting him to come and take the throne. William arrived in November 1688 with an army of 15,000 men. James's support evaporated almost immediately. His officers deserted. His daughter Anne abandoned him. He fled to France, dropping the Great Seal of England into the Thames as he went, in a gesture that accomplished nothing except to require it to be replaced. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. Glorious because, unlike the revolutions of 1642 and 1649, it was accomplished without civil war and without regicide, settled the English constitution in ways that have endured to the present day. The Bill of Rights of 1689 established that Parliament must be called regularly, that its debates must be free, that taxation required parliamentary approval, that the monarch could not maintain a standing army in peacetime without parliamentary consent, and that the Protestant succession was secured. It was not democracy. Power still rested with a narrow elite of landowners. But it established, definitively, that the king ruled through Parliament rather than over it, and that the rule of law was supreme. In 1707, England and Scotland became one. The Act of Union had been coming for a long time. The two kingdoms had shared a monarch since 1603. But it had taken a century of argument, manipulation, bribery, and genuine negotiation to turn the personal union of crowns into a political union of parliaments. The Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence in January 1707. The English Parliament absorbed it. The new state was called Great Britain. The Scots got access to English colonial markets and the security of a shared military establishment. The English got the removal of the border problem and, crucially, the secure Protestant succession they had been fighting for since the Restoration. Scotland retained its own legal system. Scots law remains a distinct tradition to this day, and its own church, the Presbyterian Kirk. But politically, administratively, and commercially, the two kingdoms were now one. The timing was not coincidental. England had spent the previous decades building something new in the world, a commercial empire based not on the old model of military conquest and tribute, but on trade, investment, and the institutional infrastructure that supported both. The Bank of England had been founded in 1694, providing the Crown with a reliable source of credit and the commercial class with a secure vehicle for their savings. The stock market was developing. Joint stock companies, in which investors pooled capital for commercial ventures and shared the profits and risks proportionally, had been pioneered in England in the previous century and were becoming the engine of economic growth. Lloyd's of London was underwriting maritime insurance. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was trading across Asia with an ambition and a reach that still strikes you as extraordinary when you read the details. This financial architecture mattered as much as any fleet or army. War in the 18th century was enormously expensive, and the nation that could finance its wars most efficiently had an enormous advantage. Britain's funded national debt, borrowed money, repaid over time from tax revenues, allowed it to spend far more on war than its tax revenues alone could support, while maintaining the confidence of creditors who trusted the British state to repay what it owed. France, which was actually richer in raw economic terms for much of the 18th century, could not do this, because it lacked the institutional trust and the parliamentary oversight that gave British government debt its credibility. This financial advantage, more than any military genius, is what allowed Britain to fight and win the succession of wars that made it the dominant world power. The 18th century was a century of warfare, almost without interruption. The War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars. Britain was involved in all of them, fighting sometimes for territory, sometimes for trade, sometimes for the balance of power, always with an eye on the commercial interest that underpinned its prosperity. The 7 Years' War, which ran from 1756 to 1763, was, in some ways, the first true world war. It was fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, India, the Caribbean, and across the oceans. Britain emerged from it having gained Canada from France, secured its dominance in India by removing French competition, and established itself as the world's preeminent naval power. The statesman William Pitt, the elder, who directed British strategy, had understood something that few of his contemporaries fully grasped: that the future lay on the seas and in the colonies, not in the complicated and expensive business of continental European politics. Naval supremacy, colonial trade, and commercial finance were the three pillars of British power. Pitt built the strategy around all three. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 was a shock, but not a disaster. The 13 colonies had been economically important, but Britain quickly developed alternative trade relationships with the new United States, which needed British manufactured goods and British capital whether or not it was politically independent. The real lesson of the American Revolution, which British statesmen gradually absorbed over the following decades, was about governance: that colonies populated by British settlers with British political traditions would eventually demand the same political rights as people at home. The model of the old empire, direct rule with no representation, was going to break down. A different model would eventually be needed, but that was a problem for later. In the 1780s, something was happening in the north of England and in the Midlands and in Wales that would transform not just Britain, but the entire world. The Industrial Revolution was perhaps the single most consequential transformation in human history since the invention of agriculture. It is worth pausing on that claim, because it is a large one, and because the Industrial Revolution was such a slow and gradual process, taking place over decades, with causes that historians still argue about and consequences that are still working themselves out, that it is easy to underestimate. But consider what it changed. For virtually the entire span of human history, until the late 18th century, the energy available to human civilization was limited by what living things could produce. The muscles of humans and animals, the burning of wood and dung and charcoal, the power of wind and water. These were real and useful energy sources, but they were ultimately biological, limited by the sun's energy, captured through photosynthesis, and by the physical constraints of living bodies. Steam changed this. Steam engines, burning coal and converting its chemical energy into mechanical work, gave human civilization access to a qualitatively different scale of power. A steam engine could do the work of dozens of horses without eating, without tiring, without dying. It could run continuously for as long as fuel and maintenance were provided. And coal, the fossilized remains of ancient forests compressed into an extraordinarily dense energy source, was available under Britain in quantities that seemed, at the time, essentially inexhaustible. Why did it happen first in Britain? The question has generated a library of scholarly argument. The answers most historians now accept include several factors. Geography. Britain sat on enormous coal deposits, and those deposits were located conveniently close to the sea and to navigable rivers, which made it practical to move large quantities of the stuff to where it was needed. Institutions. Britain had property rights, a legal system, and financial markets that rewarded innovation and protected the returns from investment in a way that was unusual for the time. Empire. British colonial markets provided both raw materials and reliable demand for manufactured goods. Cotton from the American South and from India fed the textile mills of Lancashire. Finished cloth went back to colonial markets. The empire was both supplier and customer. Culture. A tradition of practical, empirical inquiry. The Royal Society, the Lunar Society of Birmingham, the culture of gentlemanly amateur science that characterized the 18th century British educated class, produced people who thought carefully and creatively about how things worked and how they might be made to work better. James Watt, a Scottish instrument maker who worked at the University of Glasgow, improved the Newcomen steam engine in the 1760s with modifications, particularly the separate condenser, that made it dramatically more efficient. His partnership with the Birmingham manufacturer Matthew Boulton turned the improved engine into a commercial product. By the 1780s, Watt's engines were being installed in mines, mills, and foundries across Britain. By the 1830s, they were pulling trains across the landscape at speeds no one had previously experienced. The transformation of the textile industry was equally dramatic. The spinning jenny, the water frame, the power loom, each innovation dramatically increased the productivity of cotton and wool manufacturing, concentrating it in factories that could produce in a day what a handworker would have taken weeks to produce. The workers who flooded into the factory towns of Lancashire, Yorkshire, and the Midlands found wages, sometimes, better than they had earned on the land. They found hours, always, longer and more relentless than the rhythms of agricultural labour. They found living conditions that were, by any modern standard, catastrophic, overcrowded, insanitary, polluted, deprived of air and light and the social structures that had organized rural life for centuries. The human cost of the Industrial Revolution was enormous, and it was borne almost entirely by the people who had no choice about bearing it. Children worked in mines and factories from the age of 5 or 6. Life expectancy in the new industrial towns was lower than in the countryside. The river running through Manchester, contemporary observers reported, was so polluted that it actually caught fire. Friedrich Engels, who managed his father's cotton mill in Manchester in the 1840s and spent his evenings observing the working conditions of the poor, wrote a book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, that gave Karl Marx much of the raw material for his critique of capitalism. And yet the wealth being generated was also real. The middle classes, who built and managed and invested in the new industrial economy, grew in numbers, in influence, and in their sense of their own importance. They were not aristocrats. They did not own land. But they owned the new economy, and the new economy was worth more, in absolute terms, than the old one. Their demands for political representation would drive the Great Reform Act of 1832, which expanded the electorate and ended the most egregious absurdities of the old parliamentary system. Their values, practical, commercial, nonconformist, suspicious of aristocratic privilege, confident in the virtues of hard work and self-improvement, would come to define much of what Victorians understood as the British character. And their industrial capacity would give the British Empire, in the 19th century, a military and economic advantage over every other power on earth that was not just a matter of better strategy, or better leadership, or better luck. It was structural. It was built into the machinery. The 17th century produced something in Britain that was as consequential, in its way, as any political revolution: the invention of modern science. Isaac Newton was born in Lincolnshire on Christmas Day, 1642. The same year the Civil War began, which is a coincidence that feels almost too apt. He grew up during the interregnum, studied at Cambridge, and produced, in a burst of sustained intellectual work that lasted roughly from 1665 to 1687, a body of work that redefined what human beings understood about the physical universe. His laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation, published in the Principia Mathematica in 1687, provided a mathematical description of the physical world so precise and so general that it was used to calculate the orbits of planets, the trajectories of cannonballs, and the tides of the ocean, all within the same framework. It was one of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history, and it was done by one man, working largely alone in a cold room in Cambridge. Newton was also the master of the Royal Mint, which tells you something about the way Britain organized its intellectual life in this period. The man who had explained the motion of the planets was also the person responsible for ensuring that the coinage was not debased. Practical and theoretical knowledge were not separate domains. The same mind that could deduce the laws of gravitation could also run a government department with conspicuous efficiency. The Royal Society, founded in 1660 under the patronage of Charles II, was the institutional expression of this culture. Its motto, nullius in verba, they take nobody's word for it, was a program as much as a slogan. Knowledge was to be built on observation and experiment, not on authority or tradition. Its early members included Newton, the chemist Robert Boyle, the architect Christopher Wren, and the diarist Samuel Pepys, among dozens of others. The breadth of their interests, natural philosophy, medicine, navigation, agriculture, engineering, reflected the understanding that knowledge was not divided into disciplines, but was a single enterprise whose parts supported each other. The practical consequences of this scientific culture were enormous. The problem of longitude, how to determine a ship's east-west position at sea, was perhaps the most pressing practical problem of the age of exploration, and the Royal Society's involvement in its solution exemplifies the connection between pure inquiry and practical need. The eventual solution, developed by the clockmaker John Harrison over 40 years of meticulous work, was a chronometer accurate enough to allow longitude to be calculated by comparing local noon with the time at a known meridian. Harrison's H4, completed in 1759, was tested on a voyage to Jamaica and found to be accurate to within 1¼ minutes of longitude after 81 days at sea. It was not just a technical achievement, it was the key that unlocked the world's oceans. The Enlightenment, which took different forms in different countries, produced in Britain a specifically practical and empirical variant. Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, Adam Smith, David Hume, Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutcheson, built a philosophy of society and economics on observation and skepticism rather than theology or tradition. Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, in the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, provided the theoretical foundation for the capitalism that would drive the Industrial Revolution, arguing that the pursuit of individual self-interest in properly competitive markets produced collective prosperity. Hume's skeptical philosophy challenged the claims of religious authority and metaphysics in ways that remain uncomfortable reading for anyone committed to certainty of any kind. Together, the Scottish Enlightenment produced a body of social thought that shaped the world more thoroughly than any comparable intellectual movement in history. The connection between intellectual life and commercial life in 18th century Britain was unusually close. The coffeehouses of London, which served also as informal stock exchanges, insurance markets and news services, were places where merchants and intellectuals mixed freely, where information circulated rapidly, and where the distinction between theoretical knowledge and practical application was less significant than the shared commitment to finding out what worked. This culture of practical inquiry, combined with the institutional infrastructure of the Bank of England and the emerging stock market, created the conditions in which the Industrial Revolution could develop not just as a set of technical innovations, but as a self-sustaining economic transformation. The early phase of British overseas expansion deserves attention that is sometimes lost in the larger story of the Victorian Empire. The founding of the East India Company in 1600 was an act of commercial imagination as much as imperial ambition. A group of London merchants obtained a royal charter giving them the exclusive right to trade in the East Indies, pooled their capital, and sent ships around the Cape of Good Hope to compete with the Portuguese and Dutch for access to the enormously lucrative spice trade. What they found, and what they eventually made of what they found, exceeded anything they could have planned for. The Indian subcontinent was not, in 1600, an obvious candidate for British colonization. It was home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, with populations that dwarfed Britain's and political structures that had been managing complexity for centuries. The Mughal Empire, at its height under Akbar and his successors, was one of the wealthiest and most culturally accomplished states in the world. The East India Company's early presence was purely commercial. Trading posts, called factories, established with the permission of local rulers and defended by small private armies. The transformation of these commercial outposts into territorial possessions was a gradual process, driven by the dynamics of trade competition with France and by the fragmentation of Mughal power in the early 18th century. When the central Mughal authority weakened, regional powers competed to fill the vacuum, and the East India Company found itself drawn into the competition, sometimes as a participant, sometimes as an arbiter, always as a force whose military capacity and financial resources gave it decisive advantages in the turbulent politics of the subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, in which Robert Clive, a clerk turned soldier, whose personal courage and political ruthlessness made him one of the most remarkable figures in imperial history, defeated the Nawab of Bengal with an army largely composed of Indian soldiers commanded by British officers, marked the effective beginning of British territorial power in India. Bengal, one of the richest provinces in the world, became a British possession. The profits extracted from it over the following decades, through taxation, trade monopolies, and the systematic exploitation of the province's textile industry, flowed back to Britain in quantities large enough to provide a significant contribution to the capital that financed the Industrial Revolution. This connection between the empire in India and the industrialization of Britain has been the subject of serious historical debate for decades. The exact scale of the transfer is disputed, but the direction is not. Wealth generated in India and elsewhere in the empire contributed to British capital accumulation in ways that gave the Industrial Revolution resources it would not otherwise have had. The two great transformations of the 18th and 19th centuries, the acquisition of empire and the development of industrial capitalism, were not independent processes. They fed each other. The British experience of the 18th century was not, for most people who lived through it, primarily an experience of empire or industrialization. For the majority of the British population in 1750, life was still agricultural, still local, still organized around the rhythms of the harvest and the weather and the social structures of the village. The improvements in agricultural technique that historians call the agricultural revolution, new crop rotations, selective breeding of livestock, and closure of common land, were transforming the countryside at the same time as the towns were transforming, but in ways that were slower and less dramatic. The enclosure of common land, the conversion of land that had previously been available to all villagers for grazing and gathering into private property, was one of the most bitterly contested changes in British history. It made agriculture more efficient, in the narrow sense of increasing yields per acre and per worker. It also destroyed the economic independence of many rural communities, turning people who had previously combined small-scale farming on common land with cottage industry into agricultural laborers with no property of their own and no economic security except their wages. The dispossessed villagers who could not find work in the transformed countryside moved to the factory towns, providing the labor force that the Industrial Revolution required. The connection between enclosure and industrialization was noted by contemporaries and has been analyzed by historians ever since. The world that Britain built between 1700 and 1900 was not inevitable. It was the product of specific choices, specific advantages, specific moments when things could have gone differently, and didn't. The channel held, the coal was there. The institutions worked imperfectly but well enough. The combination of geography and institutions and timing produced something that the world had never seen before. A small island that remade the entire planet in its own image, in the space of 2 centuries, and then spent the next century watching that image gradually transform into something it had not entirely intended. Napoleon Bonaparte looked at Britain across the Channel for years and never found a way across. He tried everything. He built a fleet. He assembled an army at Boulogne. He planned and schemed and waited for the weather to change, for the Royal Navy to make a mistake, for some combination of circumstances to open the 21 miles of water between France and the coast of Kent. It never happened. The Battle of Trafalgar, fought on October 21st, 1805, off the coast of southern Spain, settled the question permanently. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, commanding the British fleet, broke the combined Franco-Spanish fleet with a tactical innovation that violated every established principle of naval warfare. Instead of forming a parallel line and exchanging fire, broadside to broadside, he drove his ships in two columns perpendicular to the enemy line, cutting through it at 2 points and creating a melee in which British gunnery speed and seamanship, superior on both counts, would be decisive. It worked. The combined fleet lost 22 ships. The British lost none. Nelson himself was killed by a sniper's bullet early in the battle and died on the deck of his flagship Victory, knowing that the engagement had been won. He had spent the hours before the battle writing letters and praying in his cabin, and he died in considerable pain, repeatedly asking whether he had done his duty. He had. He was given a state funeral in St. Paul's Cathedral and buried in the crypt beneath the dome, and he became one of the permanent fixtures of British national mythology. The man who saved Britain from Napoleon, who died at the moment of his greatest triumph, whose last words were, supposedly, "Thank God I have done my duty." Trafalgar did not end the Napoleonic Wars, which continued for another decade, but it ended the threat of invasion. Britain would not be invaded. It never has been since 1066. And with naval supremacy secured, it could concentrate on what it did best: funding coalitions, supplying allies, fighting on the periphery of the continent, while France exhausted itself against the combined resistance of Europe. The final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in June 1815, where the Duke of Wellington's Allied army, reinforced at a critical moment by the Prussians under Blücher, stopped Napoleon's army after what Wellington described as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life, established a new European order. Britain emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the world's undisputed leading power. The largest navy, the most dynamic economy, the most extensive overseas empire, and the ideological confidence that came from having been on the winning side of the most destructive conflict Europe had experienced in generations. The peace settlement at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 was shaped significantly by British diplomacy. Britain took strategic naval bases: Malta, the Cape of Good Hope, Ceylon, Mauritius, that extended its ability to project power across the oceans. It committed to a policy of preventing any single power from dominating Europe, which meant supporting the balance of power through judicious intervention rather than permanent alliance. This approach, selective engagement, naval dominance, commercial freedom, the avoidance of continental entanglement, would define British foreign policy for the rest of the century. The years after 1815 were, for Britain, a period of extraordinary expansion and confidence. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating, the empire was growing, the population was rising, London was becoming the financial centre of the world. The phrase Pax Britannica, the British peace, was coined to describe the century between Waterloo and the outbreak of the First World War, during which British naval supremacy maintained something like order across the world's oceans and facilitated a level of international trade and economic growth unprecedented in human history. Whether the Pax Britannica was experienced as peaceful by the people living under it depended entirely on where they were and who they were. Victoria became Queen of England on June 20th, 1837, 18 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and entirely unprepared for what was coming. She was prepared in the formal sense, educated in history and languages and music, aware of the constitutional duties of monarchy, trained to present herself in public with the composed dignity that the role required. But nobody could have been genuinely prepared for what the Victorian era would turn out to be, because nobody in 1837 could have fully imagined it. She reigned for 63 years, until 1901, and in that time the world changed more completely than in any comparable period in the previous 5,000 years of recorded history. The railway, the telegraph, the steamship, the electric light, the telephone, the internal combustion engine, all arrived during her reign. The British Empire grew from covering roughly a quarter of the world's land surface to covering more. London grew from a city of 2 million to a city of 6 million. Britain's population doubled, its industrial output quadrupled. The political nation, the portion of the population entitled to vote, expanded from less than 3% to about 60% of adult men. Victoria herself was more significant as a symbol than as a political actor. The constitutional reforms of the previous century had reduced the practical power of the monarch, and Victoria, unlike some of her predecessors, understood this and largely worked within the constraint. She had strong opinions. She was a woman of decided views, not given to uncertainty, but she expressed them through constitutional channels, through her relationship with her ministers, and through the authority of her personal example, rather than through direct political interference. Her marriage to her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, was a genuine love match in a period when royal marriages were normally diplomatic transactions. Albert was serious, intellectual, and enormously ambitious for Britain. He was the driving force behind the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, which displayed the industrial and cultural achievements of all nations, but was, transparently, a celebration of Britain's supremacy. 6 million people visited it. The message was clear. This is what industrial civilization looks like, and Britain has more of it than anyone else. Albert died in 1861 of typhoid at 42. Victoria was devastated in a way that never fully healed. She withdrew from public life almost completely for several years, wearing black for the rest of her reign, keeping Albert's shaving water brought to his room every morning as if he might still need it. Her subjects, initially sympathetic, grew impatient and then critical as the years passed, and she showed no sign of resuming her public duties. A Republican movement, small but vocal, questioned whether a monarch who refused to appear in public served any purpose. What rescued her reputation was partly the return to more visible public duty in the 1870s and partly the political genius of her Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who understood Victoria in a way that her other prime ministers did not, and who managed her political persona with a combination of flattery and genuine insight that she found irresistible. It was Disraeli who had the Queen declared Empress of India in 1876, a title that transformed her image from grieving widow to monarch of the world's greatest empire, and that she valued enormously. The Victorian era produced the apparatus of the modern state: mass public education, reformed police forces, public health infrastructure, professional civil service examinations, regulated factory conditions, reformed prisons. These were not gifts from above. They were fought for, over decades, by reformers, by working-class organizations, by radical MPs, by the slowly expanding democratic electorate. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 progressively extended the vote, though women remained excluded until 1918 and full adult suffrage not until 1928. The Victorian era also produced, more quietly, the intellectual tools that would eventually undermine the certainties on which it rested. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and the implications that human beings were not specially created by God, but had evolved from earlier forms of life by a process of natural selection that operated entirely without purpose or design, were so profound that Victorian society spent the rest of the century trying to absorb them. Karl Marx, working in the reading room of the British Museum in London, produced the analysis of capitalism that would generate the revolutionary politics of the following century. John Stuart Mill published On Liberty in 1859 and The Subjection of Women in 1869, laying the philosophical foundations for the liberal and feminist politics of the 20th century. The empire was, in this period, at its largest and most confident, but it was also generating the contradictions that would eventually destroy it. The British Empire at its height covered more of the Earth's surface than any political entity in human history. At its peak in the early 20th century, it comprised roughly 14 million square miles, about a quarter of the world's land area, and ruled over approximately 450 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population. It included Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, large portions of Africa, colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and a network of strategically vital bases and trading posts that gave it influence in virtually every corner of the world. How it came to be this large is a story more complicated than either its celebrants or its critics usually acknowledge. Some of it was deliberate conquest. India was the jewel of the empire, and its acquisition was a process of deliberate military expansion by the East India Company and later the Crown, exploiting the fragmentation of the Mughal Empire and outmaneuvering French competition. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called down the Indian Mutiny by the British, the first war of independence by later Indian nationalists, was a massive uprising against East India Company rule that was suppressed with considerable brutality and led directly to the abolition of the company and the assumption of direct crown rule over India. Victoria became Empress of India in 1876. Some of the empire was acquired almost by accident. Traders and settlers established commercial outposts. Those outposts attracted conflict with local powers. The conflict required military intervention. The military intervention created obligations that could only be met by formal annexation. Much of Africa was acquired this way, rapidly, in the period known as the Scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, when European powers divided the continent among themselves at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, with a casualness that treated the existing populations as a cartographic irrelevance. The empire rested on several foundations. Naval supremacy. The Royal Navy ensured that British trade could move freely across every ocean, while denying the same freedom to rivals. Commercial dominance. British manufactured goods, British capital, and British financial services penetrated every market the empire touched, and many markets it did not formally rule. Administrative innovation. The British developed, through trial and error, systems of colonial administration that could manage diverse and enormous territories with relatively small numbers of British officials, using local structures and local elites as intermediaries. And ideology. The British believed, with a sincerity that is difficult to dismiss entirely, that their empire served a civilizing function. That British rule brought law, stability, education, and economic development to peoples who would otherwise remain in what the Victorian mind called barbarism. Rudyard Kipling, the most popular poet of the imperial period, called it the white man's burden, the obligation of the advanced races to take up governance of the backward ones. This ideology was self-serving, obviously, and it was used to justify terrible things, but it was genuinely believed by many of the people who acted on it, and understanding the empire requires understanding the beliefs of the people who built and maintained it, not just the consequences of what they did. Those consequences were mixed in ways that simple moral judgments cannot fully capture. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807, pushed through Parliament by William Wilberforce after a 20-year campaign, and the abolition of slavery itself in the British Empire in 1833 were genuine moral achievements, accomplished at real economic cost and against the fierce resistance of colonial interests. The construction of railways, telegraphs, schools, and hospitals in India, Africa, and elsewhere created infrastructure that those territories retained after independence. The spread of the English language and English common law created tools that the people of former colonies have used to build their own post-colonial societies. But the conquest itself was violent. The disruption of existing societies was often catastrophic. The extraction of resources was one-sided and exploitative, and the racism built into the imperial system. The assumption that European civilization was inherently superior and that European rule was inherently legitimate caused damage to human dignity that had long and bitter consequences. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which perhaps 3 million people died in a British-controlled province while food was being exported, is one example, among many of the ways imperial priorities could sacrifice the lives of colonial subjects to metropolitan interests. The empire was not simply good or simply evil. It was both, inextricably, and the proportion in which it was. Each depended on where you were standing. The 20th century was the century in which Britain paid for everything. In August 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered the chain of alliances and mobilizations that brought the great powers of Europe to war. Britain entered the war on August 4th, when Germany invaded Belgium, whose neutrality Britain was treaty-bound to guarantee. The Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, watching from his window as the street lamps were lit that evening, made the remark that has been repeated ever since. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The First World War was unlike anything that had come before it. The combination of industrial weapons, machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas, tanks, aircraft, with the tactical doctrine of frontal assault, produced 4 years of slaughter on a scale that no previous war had approached. The Western Front, a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, barely moved for 3 years. At the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in a single day, July 1st, 1916. The total British dead on the Western Front alone numbered over 700,000. The war ended on November 11th, 1918. Britain and its allies had won. But the victory felt hollow in ways that no one had anticipated when the bands were playing in August 1914. The flower of a generation was dead. The national debt had increased 10 times over. The empire was formally larger than ever. Britain acquired German colonies in Africa and the Middle East, but it was visibly strained. The interwar period, the 20 years between the armistice of 1918 and the beginning of the next war in 1939, was a time of confusion and disillusionment. The general strike of 1926, in which workers across multiple industries struck in sympathy with the miners, tested the stability of the social order and was defeated, leaving long-lasting bitterness. The Great Depression hit Britain in the early 1930s, producing unemployment rates of over 20% in the industrial regions of the North. The political class, shaped by the trauma of the First World War, was determined above all else to avoid another one, leading to the policy of appeasement that allowed Hitler to rearm and expand without meaningful resistance until it was almost too late. Neville Chamberlain's agreement at Munich in September 1938, which ceded the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for what he called peace for our time, was greeted with relief by a British public that remembered 1914 with horror. Within 6 months, Hitler had taken the rest of Czechoslovakia. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war. Winston Churchill, who had spent the 1930s in political wilderness, warning about the German threat with a persistence that had seemed obsessive and embarrassing to his contemporaries, became Prime Minister in May 1940 as the Wehrmacht was overrunning France. The speed of France's collapse, 6 weeks from the German offensive to the French armistice, left Britain alone, facing an enemy that controlled the entire Western European coastline from Norway to the Pyrenees. Churchill's response to this situation was one of the most extraordinary performances in the history of political leadership. He told his cabinet that there would be no negotiated peace, that Britain would fight on regardless, that defeat was preferable to submission. And then he went to the House of Commons and gave a speech. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. You ask, what is our policy? It is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. However long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival." The Battle of Britain, in which the Royal Air Force fought off the Luftwaffe's attempt to establish air superiority as a prelude to invasion, was won by the narrowest of margins in the summer of 1940. The Blitz, the systematic bombing of British cities that followed, killed over 40,000 civilians and destroyed large parts of London, Coventry, Plymouth, Bristol, and other cities. Britain endured it. And then the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and the balance shifted irreversibly. The Second World War ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. Churchill, who had led Britain through its darkest hours, was voted out of office 3 months later in the general election of July 1945. The electorate preferred Clement Attlee's Labour Party, which had promised to build a new Britain, a welfare state, a national health service, nationalised industries, full employment, using the organisational capacity and the social solidarity that the war had demonstrated were possible. Attlee got 48% of the popular vote. The NHS was created in 1948. The welfare state took shape, and the empire began, more quickly than anyone had anticipated, to come apart. India gained independence in August 1947. It was the beginning of the end of the empire. The partition of India into the independent states of India and Pakistan, divided roughly along religious lines, was one of the bloodiest events of the 20th century. The British decision to leave quickly, rather than staying to manage the transition, contributed to a communal violence in which perhaps 1 million people were killed and 12 million displaced. The decision to leave quickly was itself driven by exhaustion, by the financial impossibility of maintaining an empire after the destruction of the war, and by the genuine recognition, present in some British policymakers before others, that colonial rule was no longer sustainable, politically or morally. The following decades saw the dissolution of the empire at extraordinary speed. The Gold Coast became Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Tanganyika, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe. The map of Africa was redrawn in a decade. In 1956, Britain and France had attempted the last great imperial adventure, invading Egypt to reverse the nationalization of the Suez Canal. The United States, which had its own interests in the Middle East and its own anti-colonial principles, forced them to stop. Suez was the moment Britain understood, definitionally, that it was no longer a superpower. It would have to operate from now on, within limits set by others. The world that emerged from the end of empire was shaped, inevitably, by what the empire had done. The English language, spoken natively or fluently by over 1 billion people, is the most direct legacy. The common law legal tradition, the parliamentary democratic institutions that Britain planted in its colonies as it left, sometimes early enough to take root, sometimes too late or too superficially to survive the first political crisis. These are also part of the legacy. The Commonwealth, the voluntary association of most former British territories, maintained some of the relationships, some of the habits of cooperation, without the coercive structure that had held the empire together. Britain itself, after empire, had to figure out what it was. A middle-sized European nation with an outsized history, a country whose identity had been built on dominance, cultural, naval, commercial, that no longer had dominance to build on. It joined the European Community in 1973, after being vetoed twice by France, finding in European integration a new context for its ambitions and a new framework for its relationships. It left the European Union in 2020 in a convulsion of national feeling that drew on the very deepest currents of the island's history. The sense of separateness, the memory of standing alone, the suspicion of continental entanglement, the belief, perhaps irrational, perhaps not, that the island's destiny had always been different from Europe's. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland today is a country of 67 million people, the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the Security Council, the headquarters of a financial system that processes more cross-border transactions than anywhere else on Earth, and the home of a language used to write more literature, conduct more business, and deliver more scientific papers than any other language in human history. Not bad for a cold island that the Romans invaded mostly to prove they could. The social reformers of the Victorian era deserve more than a footnote in this story, because without them, the industrial wealth of Britain would have remained as concentrated and as brutal as it was in the 1840s, and the democratic political culture that eventually made Britain a functioning democracy would have taken much longer to develop, or might never have developed at all. The Chartist movement was the first mass working-class political movement in British history. Between 1838 and 1857, Chartists organised petitions of extraordinary size. The 1842 petition contained over 3 million signatures, making it the largest petition in history at the time, demanding reforms that included universal male suffrage, the secret ballot, equal electoral districts, the abolition of property requirements for MPs, payment for MPs, and annual parliaments. Parliament rejected the petitions. The government arrested the leaders. The movement eventually collapsed without achieving its immediate aims. But the Chartist demands read, in retrospect, like a list of reforms that British democracy spent the next century enacting one by one. The secret ballot came in 1872, payment for MPs in 1911, universal male suffrage in 1918, full adult suffrage in 1928. The Chartists did not fail. They simply succeeded on a longer timescale than anyone involved could see. The women's suffrage movement, which reached its climax in the early 20th century, told a similar story. The suffragettes of the Women's Social and Political Union, founded by Emmeline Pankhurst in 1903, moved beyond polite petitionings to direct action. Window smashing, arson, hunger strikes in prison. Emily Wilding Davison threw herself in front of the King's Horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913 and died of her injuries. The movement was suspended during the First World War as women took on essential industrial and organizational roles that made their exclusion from the political nation increasingly difficult to defend. The Representation of the People Act 1918 gave the vote to women over 30 who met a property qualification. The Equal Franchise Act of 1928 extended it to all women over 21. The reform of the conditions of the poor was equally slow and equally fought for. Factory Acts from 1833 onward progressively restricted child labour and then adult working hours. The Mines Act of 1842 banned women and boys under 10 from underground work. The Public Health Act of 1848 began the process of building sewage and water infrastructure that eventually reduced the mortality rates of industrial cities. The Education Act of 1870 created a system of state elementary schools, beginning the long process of mass literacy that would eventually transform what political participation meant. The National Insurance Act of 1911, introduced by David Lloyd George as Chancellor, created the first state insurance against sickness and unemployment, the distant ancestor of the welfare state. None of this happened easily or automatically. Every reform was resisted by those whose economic interests it threatened, debated in Parliament with the full resources of the legal and constitutional tradition, and eventually enacted because the democratic pressure from below was too strong to indefinitely resist. The story of Victorian social reform is the story of the British political system, working as it was designed to work, slowly, conservatively, but ultimately responsive to organised popular demand. The Boer War, which Britain fought in South Africa from 1899 to 1902, was the first serious sign that the empire was not invulnerable. The conflict began as a straightforward military campaign against two small Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, whose farms happened to be sitting on some of the largest gold and diamond deposits ever discovered. It ended after 3 years of humiliating difficulty with a British victory purchased at enormous cost. 450,000 troops deployed, 20,000 British dead, and a system of concentration camps in which roughly 28,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, died of disease and malnutrition while their farms were burned. The concentration camps caused an outcry in Britain itself, led notably by a social reformer named Emily Hobhouse, who visited them, recorded what she saw, and reported it to anyone who would listen. The response from the government, Campbell Bannerman's famous description of the policy as methods of barbarism, reflected a genuine shift in British public opinion about the limits of imperial violence. The Boer War did not end imperialism, but it ended the easy, uncritical confidence with which empire had been celebrated. The cost, human and financial, was too visible. The moral complications were too obvious. The Boer War also revealed serious deficiencies in British military organisation and physical fitness. The high rejection rates of potential soldiers, many of them malnourished and physically unfit, contributed directly to the social reform agenda of the Liberal government elected in 1906, which introduced school meals, medical inspections for children, old age pensions, and the national insurance scheme. The empire, paradoxically, was making its home population healthier. The cultural life of Victorian and Edwardian Britain was as rich as its political life was turbulent. Charles Dickens, whose novels of social critique reached audiences of millions through serialized publication, did more to shape middle-class consciousness of poverty than any parliamentary report. George Eliot wrote, in Middlemarch, perhaps the greatest English novel, a work of psychological depth and moral seriousness that Victorian culture at its best could achieve. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, as poet laureate, gave the era its public voice. Gilbert and Sullivan gave it its most beloved comic forms. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood gave it its most distinctive visual aesthetic. Oscar Wilde, in the 1890s, held up a mirror to its hypocrisies that it shattered rather than look at clearly. The trial and imprisonment of Wilde for gross indecency in 1895 was not just a personal tragedy. It was a revelation of the distance between the era's public morality and its private life. The years between the Boer War and the First World War, roughly 1902 to 1914, have been described by historians as the long Edwardian afternoon. a period of warmth and colour that stands in retrospect as the last summer before a very long winter. There was genuine social reform, genuine intellectual vitality, genuine cultural flowering. There were also industrial disputes of growing severity, the emergence of the Labour Party as a force in national politics, the Irish question threatening to spill into civil war, and, in the background always, the arms race between Britain and Germany that everyone could see and nobody seemed able to stop. The particular horror of the First World War for British society was not simply the scale of the casualties, though the scale was beyond anything previously imagined. It was the way the war destroyed the confidence of the governing class in its own fitness to govern. The men who led Britain into the war had been educated at public schools and universities that taught them to believe in their own competence, their own moral authority, their own judgment. The war demonstrated, in 4 years of catastrophic mismanagement, that these beliefs were not necessarily warranted. The generals who sent young men to die in the Somme were products of exactly the same confident, imperial public school culture that had created the empire. The question of whether that culture had reached the end of its usefulness was asked by poets and novelists in the 1920s with a vehemence that shocked the survivors of the old order. Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, the war poets gave voice to an experience that the official narrative of heroism and sacrifice was designed to suppress. Owen's poetry, in particular, with its precise and devastating observation of what war actually did to human bodies and human minds, constituted a kind of moral counter-history of the conflict that has proved more durable than the official version. His line that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country is old men's lies. His rendering of the Horatian tag, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, became one of the defining cultural statements of the 20th century. The Second World War, unlike the First, produced no comparable anti-war literature from the soldiers who fought it. The moral clarity of fighting Nazi Germany was sufficient, most people felt, to justify the cost. But it produced something else, a determination that the society that emerged from it would be different. The Beveridge Report of 1942, produced by the economist William Beveridge while the war was still being fought, proposed a comprehensive system of social insurance that would defeat what he called the five giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It was read by hundreds of thousands of people during the war itself. When the electorate voted in 1945, they voted for a party that had promised to implement it. The NHS, when it opened on July 5, 1948, was arguably the most ambitious expression of collective purpose in British history. The principle it embodied, that medical care should be available to everyone who needed it, free at the point of use, paid for through taxation, was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to implement. Aneurin Bevan, the minister who created it, had to overcome the fierce resistance of the medical profession, who feared state control of their practices by an act of political management that he described, memorably, as stuffing their mouths with gold. Consultants were allowed to continue private practice. GP practices remained largely independent. The professions were accommodated, and the principle was one. The post-war decades brought other changes that reshaped British society as thoroughly as the Industrial Revolution had done, but more quietly. Immigration from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from East Africa, transformed the demographic character of Britain's cities. The SS Empire Windrush, which arrived at Tilbury in June 1948, carrying 492 passengers from Jamaica, became the symbol of this transformation. Though the transformation was not always welcomed or smooth, and the racial tensions it generated took decades to partly resolve and have not been fully resolved yet, Britain became, over the course of the second half of the 20th century, a genuinely multi-ethnic society in ways that would have been entirely unimaginable to anyone living in it in 1900. The social revolutions of the 1960s. The relaxation of laws against homosexuality, the liberalization of divorce and abortion, the explosion of youth culture, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and everything they represented, transformed the texture of everyday life in ways that the formal political history does not fully capture. Britain in 1970 was a more permissive, more diverse, more culturally confident society than Britain in 1950, and the change was felt in ways that statistics cannot measure. The economic crises of the 1970s, stagflation, industrial unrest, the three-day week, the winter of discontent, created the conditions for the most ideologically assertive government since the war. Margaret Thatcher, who became Prime Minister in 1979, pursued a program of economic liberalization, privatization of state industries, deregulation of financial markets, restriction of trade union power, reduction of income tax, withdrawal of the state from direct economic management. That was as transformative in its way as the Attlee government had been. The social consequences were complex and contested. The revival of the financial sector, the growth of inequality, the destruction of old industrial communities, the growth of a new service economy, the transformation of London into the world's leading financial centre. The Britain that entered the 21st century was, in most material respects, prosperous, stable, and free. More free in the sense of formal civil liberties than it had ever been in its history. It was also uncertain about its place in the world in a way that it had not been for several centuries. The empire was gone. The industrial supremacy was gone. The naval supremacy that had been the foundation of British power since Trafalgar was gone. What remained was the language, the institutions, the cultural legacy, the financial services, and the question, still being worked out, still being argued about, of what a post-imperial Britain was, for, and what it wanted to become. And so we come, at last, to the question we began with. How did a tiny island become the most powerful nation on earth? The honest answer is, slowly, and not entirely on purpose. There was no master plan. There was no single moment of decision, no blueprint drawn up by a Tudor monarch or a Hanoverian strategist or a Victorian administrator that plotted the route from Boudicca's revolt to the British Raj. There were decisions, thousands of them, made by people who were trying to solve immediate problems. How to stop a Viking invasion, how to fund a war, how to sell cloth to India, how to build an engine that didn't waste so much steam, and whose consequences no one could have predicted. What gave those decisions their cumulative force was a set of institutions, Parliament, common law, the rule of law, that made it possible for the outcomes of good decisions to accumulate and for the worst consequences of bad ones to be corrected, a political system that allowed for adaptation, a culture that was, despite everything, open to new ideas, new technologies, new people, in ways that were not always graceful, but were often productive. And geography, always geography, the channel that kept out the armies, the coal that fed the engines, the coastline that turned every English person into a potential mariner, the harbours that opened onto every ocean in the world. The story of Britain is not a simple story of heroism or a simple story of exploitation. It is both, tangled together so thoroughly that they cannot be fully separated. The same ships that carried colonists also carried enslaved people. The same institutions that gave Britons their rights denied those rights to colonial subjects for centuries. The same industrial power that created the wealth also created the conditions that made the lives of working people a misery until other Britons fought, generation after generation, to make those conditions better. The island did not become powerful because it was virtuous. It became powerful because it was specific. Specific geography, specific institutions, specific timing, specific luck. Understanding that specificity, understanding all of it, the achievement and the cost, the brilliance and the brutality, is what it means to take history seriously. The lights are still on, the island is still there, and the story, as always, is not over.